Most of the times you are labeled as a marketer, but to go and close large corporate accounts, like I remember you had these back 10 years ago, which means you're definitely wearing a salesman hat as well. Is it something that you embrace fully? Like, do you consider yourself a salesperson?
Don't really consider myself a salesperson, and people have enterprise sales wrong in many cases because it's nothing like selling to consumers or it's nothing like selling low ticket items. It's very, very different and it's not really it's classified as sales, but it's not really selling. And it's usually not one person selling, it's a team that's selling.
How did you make the decision? I'd be loving to like go back to when you started getting your first large corporate clients. Like, what happened? Who was it, or if that's available to disclose, and like how did that process go?
It is available to disclose, but I don't know who my first corporate client was because we've had so many of them over the years. So there's two ways to look at it. There's big logos and then there's dollar amounts. So when I first started off, we were closing big brands. They just weren't paying big dollar amounts. And then over time, you upsell them into more and more money. But like we worked with a lot of big brands from like Cisco to Adobe to Microsoft, and literally the list goes on and on. CNN, ESPN, PricewaterhouseCooper, Accor Hotels, Hewlett Packard, Panasonic, Philips. Like literally, we work with so many big brands. They all kind of blend in after a while. Not because the companies are the same. It's just it's hard to remember all the logos. There's too many of them.
Talk to me about that because you said that you went and tried to go and get the logo. So why is it so important when you get started in saying selling to businesses to go and work with these organizations where a logo will be, a great social proof?
It's not necessarily the logo. It's they want case studies and they want to know that you've worked with other big brands. But what I meant with the earlier statement was that there's the logos and then there's the dollar amounts. Typically, just because you work with big companies, it doesn't mean they pay you a lot of money. And when I first started off, we are closing the enterprise deals, and they would start you off small, and then you got to upsell and get yourself more money by cross selling. Selling more services, uh, selling the same services to multiple divisions within that company, selling it based on regions because sometimes they need help in other countries, which offers more money. But you can sell these contracts into multi-million dollar deals, and in some cases, deals that are even eight figures. The hard part with it is it takes a long time to A, build a relationship, B, to sell them, and C, to get a big enough dollar amount where it's really meaningful. Just because you're working with a company like Microsoft doesn't mean they're going to just instantly sign a contract for 10 million bucks. Sure, in a lot of these big brands you can get $1 million contracts, 2 million even bigger to start off with, but a lot of the big corporations start you off small, whatever that may be. It could be a few hundred grand, it could be a few $1 million as small, depends on the corporate size. And then you got to work your way up and then sell them on more and more and then eventually build a bigger base, right? It's land and expand.
Land and expand. And so when you went and landed deal nine, I know there's a huge amount of variability per deal, but I'd be curious to know when you say it takes a long time to kind of get your first contract versus getting the contract upsold or to a decent size, what are usual timeframes that you have at the back of your head around making a deal successful?
Takes roughly 6+ months to get one of these big contracts. Could be quicker, but let's average it out 6 months. I'm giving you rough numbers. And it'll take another year for the dollar amounts to be more meaningful.
That's interesting. So when you first got into making these types of sales, like, did you feel like it was necessary? And I don't know what was the structure, but had you raised funds to be able to sustain the operation since this deal cycle would take a long time? And I'd also be curious to know, like, what was the problem that you were planning to solve in these organizations that you felt like they're going to say yes to this?
The reason it just takes a long time is there's just a lot of different layers. You got to deal with divisions and bosses and their bosses, and then procurement and legal. It just takes a really long time to get it. Um, and the reason we ended up doing it is the churn is lower. There's a lot of money in it. And if you do really well, you can again land and expand and just get more and more and more. But I kind of fell into it as well because my background is more enterprise and consumer. I was never really a consumer entrepreneur.
I find the majority go for the consumer entrepreneur because it feels less intimidating. I mean, going and learning how to sell to a corporate, like all these layers, everything you spoke about, the longer deal cycle. I mean, you're going to spend some time without having any of the cash coming in because you have, let's say, 6 months before closing your first deal.
Oh, and then when they pay you, a lot of them are net 60, net 90, some even try to get net 120, so then it really adds up.
So how do you end up, supporting? Because I was asking if you had raised some money to support the initial funds. Like, if you're gonna go enterprise, do you need to make sure you have at least a substantial amount of financial backing? Because it will take time before you get in.
No, or just don't spend as much money and do it yourself, so then that way you have more time before you get that check in. You
Mm,
cut back on your burn, either you need cash or you just cut back on your burn.
mm. I also wanted to know, like, when you went to these, because the first times you went to these organizations and you went to sell, what I have a feeling this was maybe Kiss Metrics that you were selling. Was that the first enterprise product?
Long, long time ago, I used to sell consulting services under a different ad agency. My first real business was called ACS. It was a marketing agency. We were tiny, a few million a year in revenue, but that's when we started off years and years ago. And we were working on selling to enterprises. Keep in mind, 20 plus years ago, contract sizes were much smaller, but that's how we started off, and it just took a while. And got used to enterprise selling back then, and it just kept going.
Okay, so this is what I find fascinating is you're like, you've started this agency, you're doing advertising, like digital marketing and advertising is the core service. 20 years ago, were companies very receptive to going into that and spending, or was this like
Yes.
such a new field they didn't even know what was going on?
No, they were really receptive to it.
And so I'd be curious, why do you think they would choose to work with you when you were starting off? Because a lot of people have that start point. They're like, I don't know why somebody would choose me when there's big organizations out there that are so much more established than me. Why would they choose me?
It was much new back then too, right? There weren't tons of big organizations doing the same thing.